So last time when we talked about the Honda A case, we thought, wow, what brilliant planning. Well, I guess now that we've read the Honda B case, we have to revise our opinion a little bit, right? All these aspects of planning that we thought we had identified, well, they were actually not really there. What did they do? Yes, they tried to go after the big traditional bike segment. And only once those bikes actually, which they tried to sell, broke down, they sort of almost reluctantly sold their small bikes. Again, we tried to go after the traditional customer, not the mass market. As a matter of fact, this sort of nicest people campaign fell sort of into our laps, right, from this undergraduate at UCLA. And we, after only very big deliberation, decided to take this particular campaign on board. The low prices that they had probably was not necessarily immediately to drive kind of that positive feedback loop that we talked about, but we suspect it was maybe to overcome bad product placement. Really, the one thing that they thought about, and there was some forethought, was this regional rollout, right? Starting in California and then going across the nation. But then they missed the selling season, right? They get there in the wintertime when no one is buying bikes and they have sort of to hibernate in LA before something happens. So if planning or forethought was really not what was driving Honda's strategy, then what did actually drive Honda's strategy? So clearly Honda's son, right, the founder of Honda, had a big impact. Why did Honda not end up selling soap, for instance? Well, it was not just a whole sequence of random events, right? It was Honda's son who was a tinkerer who loved to race, and thank God for Fujisawa, right? Someone who had some business sense to rein it in a little bit. So clearly the beliefs and the values of the founder of a company have a big impact on how strategy evolves. So one way kind of to think a little bit about the evolution of the strategy of a company is to do the following. So what we have right on the top is really the values and the beliefs of the CEO or the top management team. Now that also incorporates what some psychologists would call the representation, or in this sense, what kind of organization do we want to become? Remember when Honda was founded, right? It was right after the Second World War, when Japan was completely destroyed. And I think it was Honda's son's belief that it was through technology that Japan would rise from the ashes again. And so he wanted to be part of that effort. And he wanted to have a company that was a technology company that would help Japan. Now, then of course, these particular values and beliefs, what else do they do? Well, they impact then certain policies or strategies of a company. Those policies and strategies then influence the activities, right, that a company engages in. And so we can find a number of these things, kind of the early investment in R&D that clearly drove Honda's strategy, this big investment in the plant ahead of demand, which was driving Honda's strategy. And then sort of over time, of course, these activities, some of them at least, accumulate to things like a capability or a brand or a culture. Now sometimes actually I'm being asked, when you think back to our activity systems, right, what should we put all into an activity system? And is it okay to put like a brand or a culture in an activity system? And I usually say yes, I think that's a helpful device. But if you do that, please tell me what are the underlying activities that actually create and sustain that particular culture, or that create and sustain that particular brand. So this is kind of one way of how strategy evolves. But of course there's a different thing. Because really when you think about Honda, really what was driving their strategy? It was all this adaptation, right? That these managers said, okay, we first tried this, but then it didn't work, and then we tried something else. So what we have is, there is a certain feedback loop, right? A certain feedback in terms of adjusting, being flexible. And clearly that was something that Honda, or the managers at Honda, were really good at. So what do we have? We have these activities now lead to certain outcomes. And then we see these outcomes, and then we may decide, we better change the activities. Or we actually may have to change some policies or the strategies. So in the Honda case, I guess we actually want to go after the lightweight segment rather than the heavy segment. And very rarely do we say, well, maybe we even have to kind of replace our values, our beliefs. Now that rarely happens with the same management team, but sometimes when the new CEO comes into an organization, that's really what's happening. So we have also a process here of adjustment or of feedback. But now, how did I explain this adjustment process? Right? I said we are engaging in certain activities, and then we see certain outcomes, and then depending on those outcomes, we decide of whether we have to make these changes. But the question is, what outcomes are we looking at? Well, you might say, well, it's profit, right? But profit is quite often very far removed from the activities that we're engaged in. So what we put in place are certain intermediate metrics or probes or sensors. Call this a sensor here. But now, of course, the question is, what sensor do we put in place? Well, we put in place a sensor that we believe is important. But what do we believe is important? Well, it's something up here. And so now you can start to see, right, if we are having the wrong beliefs up here, the wrong policies, we may actually put the wrong sensors in place, and all of a sudden this adjustment process may not quite work the way we hope it would. And so we'll get back to this a little later when we think about why is it that firms actually don't react to environmental changes. I think it is really important to understand how a strategy evolves within a company. Because if you want to change strategy in an organization, it is really helpful to understand where did the strategy come from. And we've done lots and lots of studies of firms and asked where did the strategy come from. And it is quite remarkable how far back quite often you can trace the origins of the strategy. And so if you want to make a radical strategic change, you better understand that history, because otherwise it might become very, very difficult for you to make this big strategic change.